The battlefield was silent now. Only the smell of blood and smoke lingered in the wind. Where thousands of warriors once shouted in the name of their kings, now lay only broken armor and forgotten names. For the Ottoman conquerors, victory was not measured by land or wealth alone. It was measured by submission, and that submission did not end when the fighting stopped, because when the men were slain, the fate of their wives had only just begun. History remembers the Ottoman Empire as one of the most powerful dynasties to ever rise, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the heart of Europe. But power always has a price, and those who stood against them often paid that price with their blood and their families. For centuries, the Ottomans followed a law that blurred the line between justice and cruelty. In victory, all that belonged to the defeated men, women, and children became the property of the Sultan. It was not written as punishment, it was written as the law of conquest. But behind those laws lay a darker truth, one that was spoken only in whispers. The wives of fallen warriors, often noble and proud, were seen not as widows, but as spoils. To the victors, they symbolized conquest itself. Taking them was not only an act of desire, it was a display of dominance. What followed for these women was a fate that many later chroniclers could not even put into words, a fate worse than death. To understand what truly happened to them, we must return to the age of Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who took Constantinople and turned it into Istanbul. Behind his victories stood a shadow empire, one that dealt not in swords or politics, but in bodies. An empire of women, imprisoned, trained, and traded, whose names were erased from history, yet whose suffering shaped the destiny of the Ottoman throne. Tonight, we uncover what the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors, and why, for many of them, death would have been a mercy. When an empire rises by the sword, every victory leaves behind ghosts. And for the Ottoman Empire, those ghosts were not only found on the battlefield but in the chambers of the conquered. It began with a law, cold, clear, and absolute. The spoils of war belonged to the Sultan. Everything from gold to grain, from horses to human lives, was considered part of the divine reward of conquest. When the men were slain or chained, their wives were taken under protection, a word that, in the Ottoman tongue, had two meanings: safety and ownership. Some were marched for days behind the army's dust trail, others placed inside guarded caravans bound for the capital. Their future no longer belonged to them, it belonged to the system. On Istanbul, the empire had perfected a quiet machinery of power, one that operated behind marble walls and silk curtains. At its heart stood the palace of Topkapi, where the Sultan ruled, and where the harem was more than a legend. To the world outside, it was a place of beauty, luxury, and desire. But within those gates, it was a place of training, isolation, and silence. New arrivals were stripped of their old lives. Their names were changed, their languages forgotten. Rank by rank, they were examined, registered, and separated, not by birth or status, but by appearance and obedience. A few of noble origin or uncommon grace were taken into palace service, where years of discipline might lead them to influence beside the Sultan's household. Most, however, were dispersed through the empire into households, courts, and fortresses unseen, unremembered. Historians later called this the divirum of women. Not an official term, but one that captured its spirit. For as boys were taken to fill the empire's armies, women were taken to fill its palaces. Yet even within that darkness, not all stories ended in despair. Some rose to power, mastering politics hidden behind curtains. Some became the mothers of sultans, women who turned captivity into command. But for the countless others, the silence remained eternal. No grave marked their names, no chronicle recorded their suffering. They were folded into the empire's memory, invisible threads that held together its golden tapestry. This was the true law of conquest, a law written not in ink, but in tears. Beyond the marble gates of Topkapi, the world outside ceased to exist. The women who entered never again saw the city's streets, nor the faces of the families they left behind. From that moment on, their world was bounded by corridors of polished stone, guarded doors, and the whispers of those who had already learned that survival meant silence. The harem was not a single hall of pleasure, but an entire system, a city within a palace, hundreds of rooms, arranged like layers of privilege and fear. The lowest ranks served as attendants and cleaners. The highest could whisper advice into the Sultan's ear. Every step up those ranks required obedience, patience, and an unbreakable will. Beauty opened the first door, but intelligence decided who would walk through the next. Tutors arrived from every corner of the empire. Lessons in languages, etiquette, poetry, and politics filled the long hours. They were taught how to walk, how to speak, how to be seen, and when to disappear. The palace demanded perfection, because perfection could be turned into power. Among them rose a few who learned that influence was the only true weapon left to them. They became confidants, advisors, and eventually, mothers of heirs. Through quiet words and subtle alliances, they shaped decisions that changed wars and laws alike. Chroniclers later called this the Sultanate of Women, a century when the empire was guided not by the sword, but by the unseen hand behind the curtain. Yet behind the glittering legend, most lives inside those walls ended in silence. For every woman who reached the throne room, hundreds remained nameless, buried within the records of servants, their hopes confined to stories whispered by candlelight. They were part of an empire that measured loyalty in patience and dignity in restraint. But even there, within the heart of power, the memory of conquest still haunted them. To the outside world, the harem was a mystery of luxury. To those who lived it, it was a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the brutality of empire itself. And though centuries have passed, their shadows still linger in the stories of Istanbul, stories that whisper of beauty, power, and the cost of survival. Empires rise on obedience, but every empire also gives birth to those who learn how to bend its rules. Within the silent heart of the Ottoman palace, a few women discovered that submission could be turned into strategy. They could not march with armies, but they could shape the men who commanded them. They could not write decrees, but they could whisper ideas that became law. Among the first was Harem Sultan, once a foreign captive, later the lawful wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. In a world where rulers changed concubines as easily as courtiers, she convinced the greatest sultan of her age to rewrite the rules. Her letters, still preserved, show a mind sharper than any blade. She guided campaigns, influenced alliances, and built mosques and schools that still bear her name. Yet her eyes also kindled resentment, whispers that the empire's destiny was now being written not by the sword, but by a woman's hand. After her came Qasim Sultan, who ruled through 3 generations of sultans, guiding the empire from behind veils and walls. Her influence stretched so far that foreign ambassadors secretly addressed her as the true mother of the Ottoman state. But power within the palace was a double-edged sword. Every victory made enemies. Every favor granted sparked new rivalry. The harem became a battlefield without weapons, fought with rumor, alliance, and patience. Some chroniclers spoke of quiet uprisings, women who refused orders, attendants who vanished overnight. Others wrote of secret alliances between servants and scholars, the hidden resistance of those who wanted more than survival. Few names survived, but their defiance echoed through the walls like a forbidden prayer. For the empire, these were dangerous years. Wars abroad, intrigue within. Yet even at its most chaotic, the machine of the palace continued to move, powered by the same cycle of fear and ambition. And behind each decree, each triumph and tragedy, stood women who had once entered through the gates of conquest. They had no armies, no banners, no monuments, only the will to endure and, sometimes, to rule. Every empire believes it will last forever. The Ottomans were no different. Their banners stretched across 3 continents. Their call to prayer echoed from deserts to frozen plains. But even the strongest stone crumbles when time decides to collect its debt. Visual direction, wide areas of Istanbul, fading from sunrise to dusk. Marble walls cracking, ivy crawling across arches, dust drifting through empty throne rooms. As centuries turned, the palace that once pulsed with ambition grew quieter. The great gates of the harem no longer opened for new captives. Reforms, wars, and changing faiths began to loosen the iron patterns of the past. What had begun as conquest slowly turned into memory. Within those fading walls, a new kind of silence settled, not the fearful silence of obedience, but the stillness that follows after generations of struggle. Many of the women's rooms stood untouched, their mirrors clouded, their letters unread. Visitors now walked those corridors as tourists, unaware that every tile once echoed with whispers of power, love, and sorrow. Historians often measure empires by the battles they won, but the truer measure may lie in how they treated those who could not fight. The harem was both prison and sanctuary, a world built to contain women, yet sustained by their intelligence and endurance. Without them, the empire would have lost its balance long before it fell. When the Ottoman dynasty finally ended in the early 20th century, the empire of shadows ended with it. The women who once lived unseen became subjects of legend and debate, villains to some, heroes to others. In truth, they were survivors, navigating the impossible with the only weapon they possessed, their will. And so, when we speak of the glory of empires, we must also remember the cost hidden within them, the forgotten faces behind the golden walls. For power built on silence leaves an echo that never fades. This was the unseen empire of the Ottomans, the empire of shadows.